Hello. So in this tutorial, what we're going to do is create a collection binding, and we'll define the collection on our element, and we're going to use the project from our previous example. So if you want to start off at this point, just go to the previous tutorial, download the project files, and import the package. So let's get started. So what I'm going to do here is just add a collection. And instead of just having a single player, say our game has multiple players. So I'm going to add that, and I'm going to delete the actual player. And I'm going to control drag over to the game player element. So now our game has many of game player element. So one thing to note here is when we created this players collection, it added this little star to the game player element. That means that Uframe has figured out that, hey, you're going to have many of these in the scene. So it adjusts things in the background a little bit to work with this scenario a little bit better. We like to call these multi-instance elements. So now we have example of one of each. The game element, which means there's only going to be one, is a single instance element, and our game player element is a multi-instance element. So now that we've made that change, let's go ahead and save it. And now we need to correct the errors from the previous tutorial and the changes that we've made. So let's open this up. Now we need to, in our controller, just go ahead and remove these guys, because we remove that property, it no longer exists. And Uframe doesn't want to remove anything. It just doesn't feel like it needs to. So now that that's corrected, all right, clear out the console. So let's go back into our controller again and start out by doing game element and do players. And let's simply add something to this collection. So like we mentioned in our previous tutorial, we have access to our game player element controller, and we'll do create game player element. And I'm going to just duplicate this line a couple times, say 3 times. And that should be it. Wait for it to compile. So now we need to click on our game view. And now we've got a collection binding. So what this does is allows us to either initialize the player's collection with things that might already be in the scene, and we do this by checking the scene first. But on collection bindings, Uframe needs a convenient place to instantiate the elements that are added to the collection. So we're always going to want to set this container property. So let's go ahead and do that just by clicking on our game view and doing a create empty child. And we'll call this players. Put an underscore just out of habit. And I'm going to drag that player's game object down to the container. All right. So when we add to that collection, it'll trigger some events through everything, or through the view model specifically, to where the view gets notified that something has been added to the collection. And by default, Uframe generates binding methods for you with the default implementation that instantiates a view by the name of the element. So in this case, we've already got a prefab here called game player. So when we run this, we get an error because by default, it's going to look by the name of the element. So I didn't name this game player element. So I'm just going to change that really quick. Call it element. Let's try it one more time. And there we go. Now you can see there is 3 elements in the collection. So right now when we run this, all of these objects are on top of each other. You can't really visually see that there's 3 there. So what we're going to do is actually go into our view and modify the binding to position these randomly. So let's go to the game element and double click on it. Go to the game view, right click on it, go to open, open game view. Alright, so now what we want to do is type in public override. And now we have an added and a removed. We're just going to do the added. Alright, so this element is passed to us and it passes us a actual view. So what we want to do is do game player element, which is our first parameter. And let's go to the transform dot position equals new vector 3. And let's do random. It looks like I've got an ambiguous reference. I need to make sure I'm using the Unity engine.random. It's kind of annoying. And let's do a range of -2 and +2. So I'm just going to copy this and apply it to all the axes. So now, if we go back into our scene, go into our game view, when we run it, you can see we got some random positions here. And this looks absolutely horrible, so I'm going to add a light. Not that it'll be that much better, but it will add some depth to these cubes we're adding. And I can't see it, so I don't know what to set them to, but I think that'll look fine. Great, that looks good. So now we're going to take it even one more step forward. So we're going to add a command to the game player element. And let's go ahead and just call this stab. So what we're going to create is whenever you click on one, we're going to say you're stabbing it. So hit save. Now let's right click on it, go to open player element controller. And here I'm going to do our standard override and do our stab method. So each time this stab is called, we are going to decrement the health, let's say 25 health points, if you will. And then we'll say if game player element dot health is less than or equal to 0, let's let our game controller know about it. So since we have our link from the game element to our player, the player has a property called game element controller. And from here, there's 2 things we could do. And it depends on how we want to delegate this out. Either way is following the model correctly. But we could access the game element view model directly, or we could have a method that's not a command on the controller that will actually process that the player's health is less than 0 or he's dead. So for this example, I'm just going to use the game element property directly, which is the view model instance of our game element. Since there's only one, we have direct access to it. Alright, so let's do players, and let's go ahead and remove him from the collection. Alright, so now that we've got this stab method implemented properly, and it's got a little bit of game logic in here, we need to actually link this command up. And you know how to do this already. Just double click on the game player element, go into the view, and do a public void on mouse down. Now doing this, we will have to add a box collider to it, but we'll do that in just a second. So on the mouse down, we'll just call execute stab. Alright, that's all we had to do. Very simple game logic. Here's our method. We're calling it from within our view. Now let's go add that box collider. So we'll go to physics and box collider. There we go. Now we should get an on mouse down event. So when we run this, let's click on one of these guys. And right now their health is defaulting to 0 because remember, it doesn't pull the health from this. So what I'm going to do is show you a little hack to where we can just enforce this and make it actually initialize the view model here. In order to do this, we need to, I'm just going to copy and paste a snippet in here and I'll explain what it does. So this is a method override for the collection binding and is called first whenever something is added. And this is responsible for just creating a view for the view model that was added to the collection in our controller. So I'm still just taking the default implementation that UFrame generated for us, but I'm calling something additionally to set that view model up. So I'm calling initialize data here. And basically all this method does is just takes a view model and applies what you've set in the inspector to that view model. So this way you can kind of get around that. I highly recommend sticking with keeping things in your controller, like here after we create this player element. But sometimes you just like to keep things simple. So in that case, this will work for you just fine. So now, we saved it and wait for it to compile. And let's run the game. Alright, so now if we click on one of these, you can see the health is currently at 100. So it properly initialized it to what we had set in our prefab. And I'm not sure which one. There it is. So as we click, you see it's going down to 25. When we get down to 0, it's gone. And that's all there is to this tutorial. Thanks for watching.